Welcome and thank you for standing by. All participants are in a listen-only mode for the duration of today's session. Today's call is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. I would now like to turn the call over to your host, Bryce Hannibal from the U.S. Census Bureau. Bryce, you may begin.
Thanks, Anthony. I appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We are pleased to hear from Nicholas Zebarth, and I'll get into his introduction in just a second. Just a few announcements. Kind of sound like a broken record at this point, but I'll keep it going. If you have any interest in presenting at the FSRDC presentation series, please reach out to me or reach out to your local RDC administrator and they will get in touch with me. We have a few presentations lined up for this for the next year, but we still have a few open slots. So it's going to be a few months before we can have a new presenter. That being said, if your RDC research is nearing completion and you anticipate going through the disclosure review process in the first few months of 2003, we will have room for you. So if you have any interest, even if you're not quite there, please reach out. We'd love to have you in the presentation series. We're going to have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. If you have a question, please type it into the Q&A slot or the Q&A box. I will be monitoring the questions along the way. If there's anything pertinent to what Nicholas is presenting at that specific time, I can interrupt and he can clarify whatever needs to be clarified. So today we have Nicholas Zebarth, who is the Eklund and Hebert Professor of Economics at Auburn University. He is presenting his research titled The Effects of the National War Labor Board on Labor Earnings Inequality. And with that, Nicholas, I turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming wherever you are out there in cyberspace. So as Bryce said, this is a paper about the National War Labor Board and its effects on earnings inequality. So this is co-authored with my longtime co-author, Chris Vickers. So along many different dimensions and measured in many different ways, there have been large swings in economic inequality in the US during the 20th century. So the one that we like to focus on is, maybe the most simple way to think about it is captured in this picture from this paper by Golden and Margot. So this just shows you from 1940 all the way through 1985, what happened to the ratio of log wages, the 90th to 10th percentile. And so what we observe is that you have this sharp decline in inequality starting somewhere around the start of World War II, continuing down into 1950s, and then remaining at a roughly kind of lowish level through the 1970s before things start to pick up. And then you've had this rapid rise in inequality since then that's continued on past the end of this graph. And so the obvious question that economists have been wondering about is what has driven this, right? What has driven this big U shape in economic inequality? And again, this is just one way to kind of get at that. This is just one measure of economic inequality. You see similar sorts of patterns in other measures too. So if you look at the share of income going to the top 10 percentile of earnings, you see a similar sort of pattern. If you look at what happens to the skill premium, you see a similar sort of thing. So there seems to be something going on here that is worth exploring. And so because of that, not surprisingly, many people have tried to make sense of what has happened to inequality over the 20th century. And we can kind of group explanations into sort of two groups, roughly speaking. So one we'll call sort of supply and demand, or maybe a different way to think about it is sort of changes in the latent distribution of earnings, or pre-market. I don't say pre-market, sort of before government intervention distribution of earnings, maybe is how you want to think about it. And so here, what people have talked about are things like changes in, say, the supply of skilled workers, as there's been a rise in educational attainment, or changes in, say, the demand for skilled workers with technological change. There's also stories about sort of superstar effects and how that's affected, again, particularly at the tippy top of the economic distribution earnings for the richest. There's another set of explanations, though, that focuses on sort of institutions, and particularly, government policies. And so again, there are many different stories people have here. Some people have talked about the roles of unions and the ways in which government has sort of supported private sector unions and then stepped away from that support over the 20th century. People have also talked about the effects of tax rates and the very high marginal tax rates you have during the first part of the post-war period up through the 1980s. People have also talked about, the minimum wage and what we've seen since over the last 30 years is sort of the eroding real value of the minimum wage. What we're going to focus on here is another institution that has been mentioned in the literature, but to the best of our knowledge has not really received any concrete support one way or another from empirical work. And this is the National War Labor Board. So I'll talk a bit more about what this is later, but quickly what this was a major institution that was set up during World War II that was in effect at its peak in charge of setting pretty much wages for the whole distribution of private sector employment during the war years. So this institution then gets, not surprisingly, rolled up at the end of World War II. But there are many economists, so kind of famously Piketty and Saez, Golden and Margo, that suggest that this institution and its effects it had on the war distribution of earnings had persistent effects on the overall earnings distribution for decades in the future. And so that's what we're going to try to address in this paper. So let me just sort of quickly tell you about what we're going to do. So again, we're going to be interested in trying to quantify the effects of the National War Labor Board and whether it had persistent effects on the earnings distribution. So what we're going to use is data drawn from the decennial censuses. We're going to be using individual level data that we're going to be able to use to measure things like labor income, understand what occupations and industries and regions people are in. And then the empirical strategy is, as I'll discuss, we're going to leverage variation by geography and occupation in the so-called bracket. This was, again, as I'll talk about a little bit later, you can kind of think of this as like the maximum wage, the soft maximum wage that you could have in a particular geography and occupation. People that earn more than that didn't have to take a pay cut down to the bracket, but people that earn less than it could not get a raise above the bracket. So we're going to try to leverage variation in how this bracket was set across space and across occupations to try to identify what the effects of the War Labor Board were. And so what do we find? Well, we find that the War Labor Board did have a persistent effect on the distribution of labor earnings all the way through 1979. So we use 1979 here because even though the census is taken in 1980, the income question on the census refers back to 1979. So that's 35 years, I guess, after the end of the war. That's a pretty significant amount of persistence. And I'll talk a little bit about how we think about where that persistence comes from at the end. So, like more concretely or more precisely, let me just explain to you what our results mean. So take 1959. We're going to have two sets of results. One that look at the conditional distribution of earnings, meaning the distribution within a particular occupation county cell. And so there what we're going to find is a 1 standard deviation increase in the bracket leads to a 5.7 log point increase in the change in the 1090 measure of inequality. Right? So this is a little bit confusing, this increase. But notice what we've done here is that we put the smaller percentile on top, the bigger percentile on the bottom. So an increase in that means a decrease in inequality. If you don't like that, for complicated reasons, you should blame Brad DeLong. So those are the conditional distribution effects. Again, those are relatively simple to estimate. They just involve, as you'll see, estimating a simple regression, but they don't exactly get at, say, the great compression picture I showed you, which is really about the unconditional distribution of earnings. So then we're going to have a separate set of results that tries to understand what was the effects of the brackets on the unconditional distribution of earnings. And what we find there is that in 1959, a 10% increase in the bracket leads to about a 2% increase in the 10th percentile of unconditional earnings distribution. So we think these are fairly sizable effects. And also it's also quite striking the fact that this has a persistent effect for decades after the end of the war. So let me tell you now just a little bit about the historical background of the War Labor Board. So this is established by executive order in January 1942. There's actually sort of deeper historical roots. There's kind of a similar sort of administration set up during World War I. So they kind of basically pull that off the shelf for World War II and start this thing rolling in January 1942. At first, it's a little bit kind of mysterious, unclear exactly what they're going to do, what their roles are, how exactly they're going to set wages. And so it's in February 1942 that you have the first sort of major decision by the War Labor Board defining and starting to set out how they were going to think about these wage decisions in a case involving the aluminum company. The really, really important kind of case for setting the basic parameters of how the War Labor Board was going to operate came a few months after that in what was known as this Little Steel case, which was basically a combination of a bunch of steel firms that were petitioning for a particular wage increase. And in that, what the War Labor Board decided is that they were going to allow for basically a 15% cost of living increase. That was like basically the amount that they had calculated that the cost of living had gone up since the start of the year. And they said, we're going to allow that, but nothing more than that. Okay. So again, at this point in time, as I was saying, it was still a little bit kind of unclear exactly what the scope of the War Labor Board's authority was. And in particular, it was mainly more focused on kind of disputes about wage adjustments. This changes then in October 1942 when Roosevelt issues an executive order that says, in effect, the War Labor Board is now going to be in charge of all voluntary wage adjustments. So it's not just disputes, even if a worker and a firm agree that, their wage is going to go up by whatever, the War Labor Board has authority to look into those adjustments. So then for us, the really crucial policy in terms of being able to try to identify the effects of this institution as a whole comes in April 1943 when Roosevelt signs another executive order, which is known as the Hold the Line order that implements this so-called bracket policy that I'm going to tell you some more about. That basically says, how the War Labor Board is going to do this is we're going to have these regional branches of the War Labor Board all across the country. They're going to collect information about the distribution of earnings in these various areas by occupation and industry and so on. And on the basis of that, they're going to set these brackets. And those brackets then are going to determine which raises are allowable and what's going to happen to people that, for whatever reason, are earning more than those brackets to start. So that is in place then for the next couple of years until the War Labor Board is formally dissolved at the end of the war in December 1945. So as I'll talk about at the end, when I talk about sort of mechanisms for persistence, some of the War Labor Board will actually come back in the Korean War. And we think that's kind of an important part of where you could get sort of persistence in the short run, the first 1 or 2 decades after the war. But then after that, we'll have to kind of think some more about how exactly the effects could continue through the, say, 70s. Okay, so what then was the bracket policy? So first of all, I think it's important to understand what the War Labor Board was trying to do. It was not in the business of reducing economic inequality. It didn't care about that per se. It wanted to aid the war effort. That's what it was after. How it thought about doing that was kind of 2 sub-goals. So one was just wage stabilization, right? So in some sense, it was kind of working hand in glove with the Office of Price Administration, which was controlling prices to manage the level of inflation. So there's a certain sense in which that's what the War Labor Board is doing as well, trying to help keep prices under control. I think maybe a more important part of what the War Labor Board was trying to do in setting these brackets was to try to control the movement of manpower into war production. So they were very worried about, these employers in different areas offering, big, high salaries, drawing people away from producing tanks or ships or planes or whatever. And so they were very worried about making sure that the wage distribution was supporting war production, making sure that war producers had the labor that they needed and they didn't get involved in these bidding wars for workers. So how did they implement this bracket policy? I've already sort of mentioned it, is they implemented it through what we call sort of a soft maximum wage. So we call it a soft maximum wage in that it's as in contrast to, say, a hard maximum wage, where in a hard maximum wage, if you earn more than the maximum wage, you have to take a cut down to the maximum, okay? That's not how the bracket worked. Instead, how it worked is that if you were initially below the bracket, you are allowed to receive a wage or a raise, but you're only allowed to receive a raise up to the level of the bracket. Those that earned more initially in the bracket, their wages were fixed. Okay, so it wasn't that they had to take a pay cut, but they could receive no further increases in their earnings. So then how did they determine these brackets? Again, it was a very complicated process. Roughly speaking, they were looking by industry, occupation, geography, and then looking at the existing earnings distributions within those cells. And so they had various ways. So one way was what they called sort of the first cluster of wages. They would kind of eyeball the distribution and sort of where they saw a cluster of wages, that's how they would set the bracket. Other times they would just look at the mean and take 10% below that. Sometimes we don't even know. It's not even clear exactly how they set it. There was a fair amount of discretion in how they determined these things in the end. So what then is the effect of what we call a soft maximum wage? So again, this is a little bit different than thinking about the effects of, say, just a regular minimum wage or a maximum wage. So it's useful to just kind of think through this for a second. And so what I have plotted here again is the change in inequality, like minus that. So increases in this thing mean a decrease in inequality. And what I've plotted along the x-axis is sort of where the bracket is set as a percentile of the initial labor earnings distribution. And so what you can see here is that there's a non-monotonic relationship between the level of the bracket and the change in economic inequality. And so what we're assuming here is that if there was no bracket, there would be a decrease in economic inequality. And that's sort of reflected by, again, if you sort of compare 0 to this one over here to 100, you can see there's a rise. So you can kind of think of setting the bracket as 100% of the earnings distribution is basically saying wages can do whatever you want. That's sort of like the free market. Whereas 0 here is the situation where you freeze the distribution in place. And so what you see is that for sort of intermediate levels of the bracket, if you increase the bracket a little bit, you're going to get a decrease in inequality. That's what's happening here, where basically the upper part of the distribution is fixed, and the lower part of the distribution gets to increase. And then if you set it higher in the distribution, in some sense, the lower part is already shifted as far as it's going to go. And now you can you're allowing the upper part of the distribution to grow as well. And so you're going to get actually an increase in inequality here. Okay. So again, it's important to kind of keep in mind that there's sort of somewhat of nonlinear, non-monotonic effects of this soft maximum wage. So let me quickly tell you about the data, which there's nothing super new here in terms of the basic underlying census data. It's just going to be, again, the population censuses from 1940 and then 1960 through 2000. We're going to use the Golden Margot sample selection. So it's going to be males 18 to 64, working at least part-time and earning basically sufficiently much, which is just sort of a multiple of what a full-time minimum wage worker would make. There's a bunch of data issues, which I don't want to spend too much time on, though it's been a huge pain. So as you'll see, there's issues with missing geographies. So in effect, some of the records of the War Labor Board don't seem to have survived. We don't know why. There's other issues where some of the records of the War Labor Board don't actually say what's supposed to prevail in some particular area of the country. So we don't really know what's going on there. There's also in some cases with these records from the World Labor Board, missing occupations. So they don't specify every single occupation what it's supposed to be. They had this idea that somehow if you just fix the distribution for certain key occupations, that everything would sort of fall into place. That's kind of an interesting theory of wage setting. It makes it kind of difficult for us because we don't really know what to do in that scenario. And so that's why in the end, what we're going to be focusing on here is these white collar and metal trades occupations where we have a very clear mapping between those occupations in the census and those occupations in the War Labor Board records. And those occupations tend to be recorded uniformly in the War Labor Board records. Okay. And the one other thing too is we're going to construct what we call sort of a hypothetical distribution of earnings in 1943, which is just before, you can think of this as just before the brackets are put into place. And that's going to take the distribution of earnings in 1939, adjust them uniformly for the growth in production worker compensation, and then apply the brackets to that. So it's going to be something like, what would happen, what should the wage distribution have looked like in 1943, like the instant after these brackets have been put in place. So let me tell you about the first set of results that we have here. So again, we're going to be looking at effects on what we call sort of the conditional distribution of earnings, meaning sort of within a particular county occupation cell. So counties are indexed by C, occupations are indexed by I. And so what I have on the left-hand side is, again, the change in a particular inequality measure. Again, I'm going to set the smaller percentile on top relative to the bottom. So a positive effect of the bracket means a decrease in inequality. And what we're going to do is we're just going to regress that on, again, the value of the bracket in a particular county at a particular time and a bunch of controls. Okay. So what are some of those controls? So we'll control for the value of this inequality measure in 1939. We'll put in some occupation fixed effects, some county fixed effects, and so on. So what is sort of the identification assumption? Under what scenario are we actually going to recover the causal effect? Well, it's just sort of the standard one that, basically conditional on controls, brackets are randomly assigned. Okay. So how do we think about that assumption? One way to think about that assumption is just sort of look at the variation in brackets that are out there. So this shows you the brackets for stenographers. So one of the occupations in our sample. And so what we have here is these thick black lines denote the different regions of the War Labor Board. So as I mentioned quickly, how this worked is that there was the War Labor Board, but then there was actually 13 regional offices, and those regional offices controlled different parts of the country, right? So there was, in effect, actually one office for all of Michigan. There was another office that was sort of, the Midwest, and so on. And so what you can see here from this picture is that there's quite a bit of variation between regions, right? So I mean, if you just look here, this region versus this region here, I mean, there's a quite a sharp discontinuity in the bracket that's being set down here in Texas, Oklahoma versus Kansas, Nebraska. There's also variation within regions, right? So the fact that, all these states here are receiving the same, face the same bracket for stenographers is not a usual thing. If you go, next door to the group of southern states, as you can see here, there's actually variation within those states. So some areas here, so this part of Alabama, not too far from where I am, actually their stenographers had a different bracket than sort of stenographers actually down here in the south central part of Alabama where I actually am. So there's variation, again, all across space here, across these War Labor Board boundaries, War Labor Board region boundaries, within War Labor Board region boundaries, that we think, again, is exploitable. So again, part of this is presumably reflecting variation in the earnings distribution across these two places, but we don't think it's totally that, okay? So, then, what are some of the, we can kind of think other ways about what are some of the threats to identification. Again, the general one is that, well, there's unobservables that affect the bracket and affect inequality in the future. what would you think maybe is determining these brackets that we don't observe is something about, again, the war effort, something about a particular area is particularly important for the war. And so, I don't know, maybe they set brackets in a different way, and that those areas then look differently in the future in terms of inequality. And so what we've tried to do here is to look at to what extent are sort of measures of war, war-related stuff correlated with the value of the bracket. And so we have a couple measures of investments made in military production, so total investment, public investment. And also we have a measure of how many inductions into the army in a particular state. And so what we find here is that, there is a sort of a statistically significant effect for inductions on the level of the bracket. But, and I guess technically there is one as well for total investment, but overall these are pretty small effects. So this is talking about a 1 standard deviation change on the value of the log bracket. So again, this is not like definitive proof of anything, but it's suggestive that, again, it doesn't seem that these at least observable characteristics, observable measures of the war effort are really determining these brackets. Okay, so with that now, let me show you the results that we have. So again, what I've plotted here are the results from that conditional distribution regression that I was just telling you about. And so again, this is the change in the effect on the change in inequality relative to 1939, so before the war. And so what I have here, right, is in blue is the change in the 10 versus the 50th percentile. The red is the 10 relative to the 90th percentile, and the green is the 50th to the 90th percentile, okay? And so what we observe is, again, if you just start here in 1943 with that hypothetical distribution of earnings, what you observe is there are strong compressing effects of the War Labor Board, okay, all across the distribution at the top, at the bottom, the top relative to the middle, and so on. And those effects persist, right? So those effects persist into 1960 and 1970 and even into 1980 if we look at the inequality measures at the top, so the 50 versus the 90th percentile. But by 1990 and by 2000, those effects seem to sort of dissipate, which I think makes some sense. But it seems like really what's going on here is the effects of the bracket are really about compressing the distribution of earnings at the top, which seems sort of sensible with what we know about how these brackets were set. Okay, so again, that's the conditional distribution of earnings. It's saying something about, within a particular occupation, within a particular county, what's happening to the earnings distribution. That's fine in some ways. It's not an incorrect thing to do. Many other people in the literature have used specifications like that. But there's a sense in which it's not really getting at kind of the great compression, right? The overall unconditional earnings distribution. And for that, we turn to a different methodology to try to answer that question. And so the idea here is we want to define the marginal effect of a change in the brackets on the unconditional earnings distribution, okay? And so the way we're going to do this is we're going to think about some hypothetical transformation of the underlying brackets, right? So through what we call a scale location shift model. So basically you take the original bracket, W bar, there's a scale shift. So that's what this S of delta you can think of as doing, scaling the brackets up or down. And there's also a location shift, shifting the mean around. And that's going to give you this hypothetical distribution, W bar delta. And so with that, then we can define what the marginal effect is as this quantity here. It's just going to be, think about taking the limit as this delta goes to 0, right? So it's a marginal change in the distribution of the brackets relative to the original distribution of the brackets, okay? So that's what we're going to call the marginal effect on the tau quantile. And again, this is the effect on the unconditional distribution of earnings. So it's not conditional, I think, it's the unconditional distribution. So you can read off from this, if the marginal effect is 2% or whatever, it's telling you that on the 10th percentile, that again, the 10th percentile of the unconditional distribution of earnings is going up by 2%. Okay. So what we can do is actually decompose this marginal effect into two pieces. We can actually decompose this into a location effect and a scale effect. So the location effect is telling us something about what the effect of a 1% increase in the mean bracket is on the earnings distribution, versus the scale effect, which tells us something about a 1% decrease in the standard deviation of the distribution of the brackets is, what its effect is on the earnings distribution. Okay. So I think this is kind of interesting in that it allows us to think about, if we just shifted all of the brackets up, what would we expect the effect to be on the earnings distribution? And a separate question of if we just, reduced the variation in these brackets, what would we expect to happen to the earnings distribution? Okay. So this whole methodology generalizes, if you know about this, the unconditional quantile regression approach of Firpo et al. So in some sense, they're focused only on this location effect part of it. But what we're going to allow for is also the scale effect, which again, we think is kind of interesting. It sort of answers a different question. If, again, the World Labor Board had set the brackets in a slightly more uniform way, what would the distribution of earnings have looked like in these subsequent years? So what then are the effects? So what we're going to look at now again is, this is first the location effect. So this is answering if the mean of the brackets went up by 1%, what would happen to the various percentiles of the earnings distribution, right? So, we have the green is the 10th percentile, the blue is the 25th percentile. The triangle, the red triangle, I guess, is the median. The 75th percentile is the black diamonds, and then this pink dot is the 90th percentile. And so what we observe is, again, sort of similar to what we saw with the conditional distribution effects, is we observe persistent effects of the brackets all the way through 1979. And these effects are really concentrated at the bottom, in the sense that a 1% increase in the mean value of the bracket would lead to an increase in the bottom percentiles of the distribution, right? So that's what you can see here. 1% increase in the mean of the distribution would lead, or a 1% increase in the mean of the bracket would lead to an increase in the 10th percentile, the 25th percentile. And there's sort of slightly kind of some negative effects on the top part of the distribution, which we're not exactly sure how to think about at this point in time. But one thing that's nice about, again, these marginal effects is if you want to get the effect on inequality, you can just add them together, right? So the effect then, the location effect on, say, the 90-10 measure of inequality is just going to be the sum of the effect on the 90 and minus the effect on the 10th percentile. So how do we interpret then these effects? Well, we interpret them in this way. So if you think about, say, a 10 log point increase in the mean value of the bracket, that explains something like 10% of the income inequality decline that you observed during the Great Compression. So again, we think this is sort of a meaningful amount. Is it everything? No. Is it exactly what we want, in the sense of, is this exactly telling us what would the income distribution have been without the World Labor Board? No, that's kind of a hard counterfactual to address with the approach that we've taken so far. But we think this is at least suggestive that the World Labor Board played an important part in the decline in inequality during the first 20 or 30 years after the war. And then it's interesting that, then after that, when these effects sort of disappear and there doesn't seem to be any effect on the earnings distribution, that's when you start to see, again, sort of this unmasking of the latent changes in the earnings distribution and rising inequality. So what about the scale effects? Nothing here. So I was kind of bummed. I was hoping that we were going to find some scale effects, again, coming from slightly more compressed distribution of earnings, a slightly more compressed distribution of the brackets. Turns out there's just not much there. These are statistically significant, but they're really small. So it doesn't seem like that piece of it, that piece of the marginal effect, is really an important one. So in my last few minutes here, I want to kind of just talk a little bit about how we think about where this persistence comes from. What are some of the possible, mechanisms? Again, I don't have any formal econometric evidence here. If you have some ideas on how to approach that, we would be all ears. It's been hard to kind of think about what it should be. So the first thing that, again, I want to emphasize, at least in the short run, and I mentioned this at the beginning, is that we think that part of the story here is that the War Labor Board just sort of gets recreated, reinstituted during the Korean War. So there's the Korean War price controls, and there's also a wage stabilization board during the Korean War, which basically did a lot of what the National War Labor Board did, use kind of the same basic ideas, same basic principles. And so we think it sort of makes sense that that distribution of earnings that the War Labor Board had set up at the end of World War II then gets sort of, again, kind of copied into the Korean War and into the 1950s and maybe the start of the early 1960s. After that, it's a little bit more difficult to kind of make sense of where this persistence comes from. We think that unions are important here. Again, I don't have formal evidence, but we have like a number of, I think, suggestive quotes that unions used in many cases the distribution of earnings and the data that was collected by the War Labor Board in coming up with how they bargained over wages. Okay, so there's a couple nice quotes here from this was a paper this guy wrote, sort of surveying unions and asking how they thought about where the distribution of earnings came from, what the role of the War Labor Board was. This is a nice quote from the Marine and Shipbuilding Workers Union, which basically says, we haven't done anything to the wage distribution since the end of the war. So again, this is not definitive evidence. It's just some suggestive evidence. We have some more suggestive narrative evidence in the paper. But we think that, again, part of the story is here, again, the short run, the effects that the Korean War had and the explicit wage controls that came with it. And then after that, we think that there's a major role here played by unions and how they pattern the way they approach bargaining with these big employers in the couple decades after that. So I guess so then, where are we headed? Well, again, we're always interested in looking for other identification strategies. If people have ideas about how to think about identifying these effects, that would be great. As I mentioned, we're trying to figure out other ways of testing these persistence mechanisms. And we're also interested in, broader ramifications. So we're interested in looking at other labor market effects, looking more explicitly at some of these other dimensions of inequality. We're interested in whether there are demographic or political effects. Does this compressed distribution of earnings affect how people vote or family formation or how well children do? And we also want to get at some of these general equilibrium effects. In some sense here, we're taking a very partial equilibrium reduced form approach, but it would be interesting to think about, again, kind of the general equilibrium effects that these sorts of policies have. So I guess Bryce asked me to do this. So my last 2 minutes then, I guess I'll mention what I wish I would have known about the RDC before I started this whole project. I guess for all of these things, I think I should have known it before I started, but it wasn't made totally clear until I actually got into this. The first thing I'll mention is that the data cleaning took a long time, much longer than I was expecting. I was expecting the census data to just be perfect, pristine, not a single problem with it at all. That's not true. It's not like the IPUMS data or things like that. It takes a lot of time to get the data in a shape that you can really make something of it. The other thing too, which again, maybe people realize, maybe they don't, it's really difficult to work without the internet. I mean, just for like simple things, Googling a command, Googling, whatever, not being able to do that is really challenging. I don't have a great solution to that, but you should just be prepared that it's challenging to be without the internet, which again, sometimes it can be a great distraction, but other times it's a great resource to just answer quick questions about simple commands. And then finally, I would say that, it's really useful to have an understanding of shell commands to be able to do some basic stuff from the command line. that's going to make your life a lot easier working in the RDC. It's possible to kind of get around that, but if you know how to do simple things from the command line, it's gonna make your life a lot easier. Okay, so with that, I think I'm kind of out of time, so I guess I'll answer any questions people might have.
Great, Nicholas, thank you so much. Can you see the Q&A, or do you want me to read them off to you?
I can see the Q&A.
Great. I've got one that I didn't put in there too.
Oh, sure. Okay. Do you want to put in there, or should I?
Oh, I'll just ask you when you're.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so there's one question about, I think this is back at the start, about whether all institutions are about redistribution or equity, or whether there are institutions that increase inequality. I guess the answer to that is, yeah, I think there's institutions that work in different directions. I mean, the ones that I guess mentioned at the start, I mean, I think you could say, like with taxes, at the start, presumably high marginal taxes reduced economic inequality, but then, starting with the tax reforms in the 80s, those decreases in tax rates probably worked in the opposite way to push up economic inequality. So then I guess the next question was, were services covered by the War Labor Board? And then a question about the growth of the tertiary sector after World War II. So yeah, roughly speaking, the War Labor Board covered all private wage adjustments, subject to some minimum size. So you had to be like, I think you had to have like eight employees or something like that. So by services, you're thinking about kind of, hiring a nanny or hiring someone to clean your house or something like that. Those wouldn't have been presumably subject to the War Labor Board. But, it's hard to get an exact number, but we think that the vast majority of everyone was in effect kind of covered by the War Labor Board that was, again, involved in the private economy. I guess I'm not sure about the other part of this. Maybe this person can clarify what they have in mind about this growth of the tertiary sector after World War II.
So maybe while they do that, if they choose that, I had a question about Michigan. Well, what was going on with Michigan?
Sorry, say that one more time.
My question was, you were talking about those different regional offices of the.
Yeah.
So why did Michigan get its own office?
I mean, it was automobiles, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's simply it, right? It was a really important part of war production, Detroit, and so that's why, I mean, I don't have any narrative evidence about this, but I think it's pretty clear that that's what they had in mind when they said, well, Michigan needs to be on its own separate island, as you could say.
Yeah, that's kind of what I figured, but I wanted to get your input on it. Okay, so we had some clarification on this other question.
Okay, so this follow-up question now is, how much inequality arose from new industries and firms? It's a good question. I don't have a good answer to that one. I don't know off the top of my head. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's an interesting question. I think, yeah, clearly today, if you think about inequality, you think about tech and new industries in that way. I don't know the answer to that, say, if you go back in time in the 60s and 70s and things like that, how much of it is due to entry of new firms? It's an interesting question that presumably you could answer using the census data. Other industries. Yeah, so another question was about, were there other industries not already mentioned that had brackets instated? Yes. So again, we're actually, so again, let me clarify. the brackets in general were set by region, by occupation, and by industry. Okay. So what that means is that, you could have, an electrician in Auburn, Alabama. One is in, industry X, one is in industry Y, and they would be subject to different brackets. Okay. Again, I'm not saying that was always the case, but it was in principle possible. What we're focusing on here are a class of occupations where the brackets were cross industry. So there was actually no industry variation in these brackets in these particular occupational classes that we're looking at. But in effect, yes, there were many industries where you had brackets instated. I mean, pretty much all of them. And in many cases, the brackets differed by those industries. We're just not we're not using that piece of it at this point in time. Part of it is that it's difficult to match industries across the War Labor Board records and the census records. They don't, it's not like everyone is using 3-digit NAICS codes or something like that, which is it was sort of part of the issue we were having with also matching occupations in the first place. So there's another question. So there's another question about how we quantified the pre-existing distribution, and was it done in a way that would have been observable to the people who set the brackets at the time? Yes. So what we do in the regressions is we're actually controlling for the distribution of earnings in 1939. So that's not exactly the distribution of earnings that the people at the War Labor Board would be looking at. They did have some of that information. So it's actually quite interesting if you go and you look at the original records of the various regional offices, you'll find the stuff about what the actual values of the brackets were. You'll actually find a bunch of information too about these wage surveys that they did. So they actually went out and surveyed employers about, what they were paying their workers, their electricians or stenographers or clerks or whatever. And that was what the War Labor Board used to actually set these brackets, right? So they actually tried to go out and measure these local distributions of earnings, and that's what was observable to them. So the idea that we have is that somehow the distribution of earnings in 1935 is a reasonable proxy for what the distribution of earnings looked like in 1943, just before the brackets, which is what the War Labor Board people would have been observing. Okay, again, is that perfect assumption? No. Obviously there's, over that period of time, there are changes in relative earnings across groups that we're just not going to capture. But that's kind of the idea here is we're going to at least try to control for the distribution before the war in 1939, with the hope that controls for much of what happens in those first few years of the war before the brackets are put into place. So there's also a question about price controls. So I think the question is, were there price controls too? If so, they were different in design from the War Labor Board. Yes, there were price controls. So, I mean, in a sense, it's a little bit, as far as we can tell, it's a little bit puzzling in that, there's the War Labor Board over here, and there's an Office of Price Administration over there. And you would sort of imagine that these people would be talking to one another, trying to figure out, okay, how are we gonna set prices and wages and stuff like that. As far as we can tell, that didn't happen. These people were just sort of off in their own different worlds. So we don't know a whole lot actually about what exactly how the Office of Price Administration operated. I mean, there's histories and things like that, but in terms of microeconometric evidence about how the Office of Price Administration was setting prices and what the effects of that were on whatever, I'm not aware of it. So, we've kind of gotten this question before asking about, well, what about price controls and things like that? Like to, to first approximation, my sense is like they were set, orthogonal to the wage control. So I'm not too worried about, the price controls somehow contaminating what we're finding here. But I do think that there is kind of a more general question of, well, what were they doing? How are they making those decisions? What were the long run effects of those price controls? Super fascinating question. I am not aware of any kind of microeconometric paper that addresses that question, though. Let me see here. Okay, so now there's a question about programming languages in the RDC. I mean, you can use whatever you want. So you could use. So I think we actually used every single one of the programming languages that you mentioned. We used SAS, we used R, we used Stata, and we used Python. So you have to use SAS to actually get the initial extracts from the census data. And then after that, we did most of our data cleaning in Stata. And then we actually end up using R because R has some packages that Stata doesn't have. And we also use Python to automate some of the submission of jobs to the computing cluster. So I wouldn't say the RDC favors one or the other, but yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if you end up having to use all those programming languages plus, shell commands. So anyway. Okay, so now there's a question about World War One.
I think that's referencing the price controls question above.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Sorry. I misread that. I think there were price controls during World War One as well. I'm not 100% sure on that. I think there were. I don't think it was as extensive as what happened during World War Two. Again, I think how World War One, like the importance of that is really, again, it kind of was a trial run, a dry run for how the how the government, the federal government, was going to respond to these sorts of episodes. And so, it's partially that you pick up the stuff from World War One and like bring it back for World War Two, but also part of that sort of administrative ideas about how to make this work actually gets brought back during the New Deal and some of the policies that Roosevelt runs, like the National Industrial Recovery Administration, things like that, that really have these close connections between government and industry and talking about how we're going to, regulate competitive behavior and all this stuff. A lot of that kind of thinking that this is a good idea, how this is going to work. And it goes back to sort of World War One, and then it sort of continues through the 30s, and then, again, comes back with a force in World War Two.
Okay, so let's give it. Oh, there's enough. I spoke too soon.
What were the most challenging?
So she's asking what Lauren's
Yeah.
asking. What were the most substantial or most challenging data cleaning issues you came across?
Can I say all of them? Yeah, I mean, again, I'm not exactly sure how much I can say. I'm not sure what I can divulge, but yeah, there's a lot of them, even sort of, again, simple things about, top codes and things like that. It's hard. Some of the documentation is not super clear. And so it's really kind of everything, from like the simplest variable on down. You just have to be incredibly careful about understanding exactly what it is, how it's coded. And so, everything is how I describe it. So that's not super helpful. Again, I don't know how much I can say given the public forum we're in right now.
I think maybe it's safe to say that, you may have an idea that certain data sets that reference similar topics may be easily merged or combined. But oftentimes at Census, you have different offices collecting different aspects of data. And like you mentioned with the price controls and the wage controls, not all offices speak to each other as efficiently as one might hope. But it is possible. I'm
Sure.
fairly comfortable saying that the vast majority of RDC research merges data sets in one form or another. So
Sure.
it's
Sure.
certainly
Yeah, I'm not, again, you shouldn't take my comments here as being wholly negative. It's more of just a caution or a warning that, things are going to take longer than you expect. I mean, that's sort of true in general, but I think it maybe applies a little bit more here where you might maybe go in with a little bit more of an optimistic sense that the data are going to be just sort of pristine and ready to roll with.
Okay, let's take a look. Well, let's give it maybe just another minute or two if anybody has any last minute questions. But Nicholas, thank you so much for your time, for your research, for presenting what you've discovered. I think this is the first presentation that's really taken a historical look. Well, I should say that taking a look at a historical program and its effect moving forward within the RDC presentation series. So great to see the variety and the variability of research that can be addressed with RDC data.
Thank you.
And
Thank you
with
for having
that-
me. And if other people have other questions, I'm happy to, please shoot me an email. I'm happy to chat offline.
Perfect. Well, with that, let's go ahead and close it up. So thank you so much, everyone, for attending. We really appreciate it. We will have another presentation in March, March 29th. So go ahead and put that on your calendar, and we will reach out in a similar fashion to make sure everybody knows about it well ahead of time. So again, Nicholas, thank you so much, and thank you for everybody for attending.
That
Thank you.
concludes today's session. You may disconnect at this time. Have a nice day.